talking to Cornelius. Conversation 5. I can't ask you what the convict system was like, old man. Chances are you wouldn't want to speak about it anyway. The whole business was a matter best left unspoken in your day, one of many instances in our island's collective shame. I suspect the genuine horror of the system in 1844 is better understood in terms of a Kafka story, rather than the otherworldly gloom of for the term of his natural life. You and your brother shuffled into the modern, impersonal horror of being a number in a bureaucratic system, identified as a series of answers to a set of standard questions, reduced to an item in a well-bound book, whose progress was dispassionately recorded. It's no surprise the system evolved in the era of the Industrial Revolution, when progress was measured through the success of feeding large quantities of raw material into a process that created useful, uniform products. The probation-era convict system was the same deal. You and your fellow convicts were the raw material, mass-processed through a newly created probation system and coming out the end as fit and experienced workers ready to fill the expansionist needs of the colony. The last time we spoke, you were still in Dublin's Smithfield convict depot, inhaling the fumes of the all-surrounding cattle markets and possibly weaving the occasional mat from coconut fibres. It took 9 months until word came through that it was time to leave. The Smithfield prison record registered that you and James and a number of other convicts were disposed of on the 1st of July 1844 to the ship Emily. The language said it all. The impersonal business of mass people processing had begun. I personally find it reassuring that terribly well-designed processes don't always work when applied to human beings. There's nothing I love more than the iconoclastic crash of a system. Maybe I feel that way because I'm your descendant. There'd been trouble a couple of months before your July 1844 departure. Kilmainham Jail was another place near Dublin where transport-bound convicts were gathered. The convict ship Cadet arrived in Kingstown, now called Dunlera, in April. 116 convicts had to be moved from Kilmainham to the ship, but the whole thing nearly went pear-shaped. Word spread through Dublin and the nearby countryside that the convicts were about to be moved. A riotous, disorderly mob, as described by the Dublin Evening Mail, soon gathered, and the governor of the jail, Mr. Allison, was afraid that either a rescue might take place, or, possibly worse, the mob might supply the convicts with whiskey, and so render their exportation a matter of danger and difficulty. The mob threatened, but didn't win the day. The convicts were successfully put on board by 3 that afternoon. I presume the basic logistics were the same on the 1st of July when you were taken from Smithfield down to the convict ship, the Emily II, that was anchored at Kingston. There would have been the usual morning routine, the line-up for the rice, oatmeal and milk dish called stir-about. A line of covered cars would have arrived outside the depot, accompanied by local constables and possibly others from the country. The near ride at Kilmainham probably meant there was a heightened sense of alert among the constables. I can imagine them lined up, cudgels in hand, around the covered cars and their horses. They would have been keeping an eye on all the narrow lanes leading into Smithfield. There would have been an impatience to see the convicts loaded into the dark interior of the cars and driven out. The Southern Reporter and Cork Commercial Courier on the 6th of July 1844 gave an account of your departure from Smithfield and mistakenly named your destination as Sydney. 90 convicts, heavily ironed, were embarked on Monday last from the Smithfield Convict Depot, Dublin, for Sydney. 50 more were to be sent on board this day. The convicts, lately sent up to Dublin from the county jail, will not be transmitted to the ship until it is ready for sailing. It is expected that the convict transport will sail on Tuesday or Wednesday next. You and James were among the first convicts on board the Emily. It was another period of waiting in what was essentially a multi-storey floating prison. Once on board, in your heavy chains, you would have cautiously descended the ladders below deck, stooped to pass through a gated doorway, and then found yourself in a long cell. On arrival, the long tables were uncovered for meals and other activities. At night, the tables became the base for beds. You would have registered the familiarity of a cell, but now with the added sensation of creaking timber and lapping waves. The full number of convicts to be transported on the Emily 2 was 203 men. Their average age was 26. The majority were Catholic labourers, sentenced to 7 years transportation for acts of petty theft. The youngest on board was a 12-year-old pickpocket, Robert McKeever, who was given 14 years for stealing 6 books. He would spend the rest of his life in and out of trouble and in and out of institutions. There was a 13-year-old on board, James Fitzpatrick, and 7 15-year-olds. All the 15 and under boys would be sent to Point Pure at Port Arthur as soon as they arrived in Van Diemen's Land. The rest were destined for the multiple probation stations that were spread across the island colony. There were at least 11 military men among the convicts, 7 deserters, 3 had assaulted superior officers, 1 had carried out mutinous conduct, and 1 had been insubordinate and struck a corporal. John Hughes, a 27-year-old Protestant soldier, had attempted to stab a corporal of the 45th Regiment with a bayonet. In the general convict community, there were 3 men sentenced to transportation for sacrilege. They stole vestments and silverware from churches. The sheep, cow and pig thieves mainly came from the west. The 28-year-old sheep thief John Lawler was described by the ship surgeon as a sulky, grumbling fellow. Patrick Hughes was transported 7 years for perjury. In his words, "I swore Mary Mannion burnt a house down in County Mayo." You weren't the only family-connected convicts on the Emily. John Bell, 45, and his 18-year-old son James had a 7-year sentence for larceny. The Cusack brothers from Limerick and the Dooley brothers from Cork were also on board for larceny. The 3 Gilligan brothers were lifers. They'd committed manslaughter by attacking the father of a man they didn't like with sticks. There were men on board whose lives were destined to go from bad to worse once they arrived in Van Diemen's Land. William Marr, a 22-year-old Catholic sheep thief, murdered a Marine in 1857. He was sentenced to be hanged and dissected and was executed in Hobart in November 1857. The lifer Michael Moriarty, who raped a woman and claimed "I was drunk and knew nothing," later stabbed someone at Oyster Cove with the intent to kill. He spent a paltry 2 years at Port Arthur as a consequence. Patrick Maloney, a 19-year-old thief who stole 18 watches, was tried in Oatlands in 1850 for robbery armed with a gun. He was sent to Norfolk Island. His criminal life continued when he returned to Van Diemen's Land. He was finally executed in Launceston in 1861. Such was the wide spectrum of a ship full of convicts, a strange mix of petty and serious criminals, military men who had seen something of the world, country labourers whose whole universe hadn't extended beyond the limits of their county. There were older men on board, according to the surgeon's records, who only spoke Gaelic. There were men on board who would never get over this thing they were about to experience.